Hi, I'm Dr. Robert Williamson. I am Professor of Religious Studies at Hendrix College and the pastor of Mercy Community Church in Little Rock. I'm also the co-host of the Bible Worm podcast and the author of this little book, The Forgotten Books of the Bible, Recovering the Five Scrolls for Today. This lecture is the first of two lectures on the book of Ruth that goes along with my book. You are welcome to use these lectures for your class or for your book club or just for your own personal use. However you find them useful, I hope you will make use of them. Today we're going to look at the book of Ruth, and I'm going to look at it in particular as a book about the welcome of immigrants, speaking, I think, to a time of anti-immigrant anxiety in ancient Israel during their return from exile. So I'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. Next time, then, we're going to come back and look at the book of Ruth and look at the ways in which the book of Ruth is not as welcoming as it might like to be. It's engaging in stereotyping and some other problematic behaviors as it comes to Moabites, Ruth the Moabite. So that's where we're headed. So I mentioned that I think the book is written in the post-exilic period. There are two arguments about this. One is that it's written in the post-exilic period around the time of Ezra and Nehemiah. The other is that it is written sometime fairly soon after King David, so a little about 300 years earlier than that. So I find it useful to read it as written in the post-exilic period, and I'll explain why. So just so all these terms make sense, here's a little timeline of ancient Israel. So we can start with the Exodus. It's a little hard to date the Exodus, but somewhere around 1250 BCE. Following the Exodus, according to the biblical story, Israel is ruled by a series of judges for about 200 years, from roughly 1200 to 1000 BCE. These stories are found in the book of Judges. At the end of the period of Judges, there arises the great king David. David establishes a monarchy in Israel, and that continues on, at least in the southern kingdom of Judah, or Judea as it comes to be known later, until the year 586. In 586, the southern kingdom of Judah and its capital Jerusalem are destroyed by King Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians, and the elites of the city are taken away from Jerusalem and they're set up in exile in Babylon. This period is remembered in the biblical text as kind of a traumatic moment of destruction and being taken away from the homeland. It lasts for about 50 years, properly speaking, until the Persians come along. And until people really start to return, it's about another 100 years or so after that. Following the exile is what we call the post-exilic period. In that period, Judah is ruled by the Persian Empire. It's the province of Yehud. And people start to return from exile to reestablish Jerusalem, reestablish the temple, and reestablish just the society of Judea, or Yehud. In this period is our friends Ezra and Nehemiah. Now the argument is, so the book is self-evidently set in the period of Judges. It says that in the first verse. In the time when the judges ruled is how the book opens. And so we know that's where it's set. So it is pre-David. But the book probably wasn't written then. People argue about when it was written. We're going to take the perspective that it was written all the way down here in the period of Ezra and Nehemiah. The argument is not a clear-cut one, but it's one of two positions about the book, really. One is that it was written here, and I find that position really useful to read the book of Ruth against the backdrop of Ezra and Nehemiah. So I don't really want to make the argument here for sure that it was written then, but to say if it was written then look what an interesting text it is. So with that background, we can move to the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. Ezra and Nehemiah were writing around the middle of the 5th century, sometime around 450 or thereabouts. And so we can learn from them about what was going on in that period after the return from exile. So if you look in Ezra chapter 9, you find the people are struggling with why did we get sent into exile? And, they've just come back from exile, they're reestablishing, and they think, we don't want that to happen to us again. So, what do we need to do differently this time? And what they decide is that at least part of the reason that they got sent into exile by God is because they married foreign women. And so the people of Israel the officials come to Ezra and they say, look, the people of Israel haven't kept themselves separate from the neighboring peoples. That is, they're intermarrying with people of the land. And then they name Canaanites, Hittites, Perizzites, Jebusites, Ammonites, Moabites, which is what Ruth is going to be, Egyptians and Amorites. And they've taken their daughters as wives, and they have had sons with them, and now there is this kind of mixing of Israelites with other people. And they say, this is something that the book of Deuteronomy prohibits. This is why God was angry with us in the first place, and God is going to be angry with us again. So at the end of the book of Ezra, the elders speak up again, and they say, look, we've been unfaithful to God by marrying foreign women, but there's still hope. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to make a new covenant with God, and we're going to send away all our wives and children, according to the advice of my master. So the book of Ezra is in its own way about the ethnic purification of the Jews when they return from Israel. They say, we are intermarrying with the people of the land, and God is upset about that, and God said in Deuteronomy not to do that. And so what we're going to do is we're going to send away all the foreign wives and all our children who are the products of intermarriage. We're going to send them away. And that's kind of where the book of Ezra draws to a close. So the question about in Ezra and Nehemiah is, how do we make Israel great like it was? And the answer, at least in part, is we send away, we separate ourselves from foreigners and immigrants. That's how we're going to make Israel great again. Okay, now I mentioned that Ruth is a Moabite, and so we just need a little bit of a background about Moabites. Moab is right, so here's Israel, and here's Moab, right across the Dead Sea. So they are the close neighbors. They're near enough to be familiar, but far enough to be kind of troublesome. And so you can imagine contemporary contexts, foreigners who are nearby foreigners, and how that's different than far away people from sort of exotic lands. The book of Genesis in chapter 19 remembers a story about where Moabites came from. Now remember, this is the Israelite story about the origins of Moabites. So if you asked a Moabite where they came from, they would not tell you this story probably, but this is the Israelite memory. Basically what happens is that Abraham's nephew Lot has gone and made a home in Sodom, as you remember, and in Genesis 19, God comes and destroys Sodom, and Lot and his daughters escape. Lot's wife, remember, looks back and she is turned into a pillar of salt. But his daughters escape, and he escapes, and they go and settle in Zoar and in a cave. So now these two daughters think that they are the only people left on earth. Their society has been destroyed, right? And so they say, well, how are we going to continue humanity? And so what they decide to do, there in verse 31, the older daughter said to the younger, our father is old, there are no men in the land to sleep with us as is the custom. Let's give our father wine to drink and lie down with him, and we'll have children from our father. So they served their father wine, and the elder daughter went in and lay down with her father without him noticing when she lay down or got up. This is going to become important, by the way, next week, so remember this story. They get their father drunk, and without him knowing, they go in and sleep with him and become pregnant. So the older daughter does it one day, the younger daughter does it the next day, and then they have children. The older daughter gave birth to a son, and they called him Moab. He is the ancestor of the Moabites. And then it goes on to tell you that the younger son is Ammon, who is the ancestor of the Ammonites. So this is the story of where Moabites come from. They are the products of drunken incest from Abraham's cousin Lot, nephew Lot, and his daughters. Now, elsewhere in Deuteronomy, we get this prohibition. Ammonites and Moabites cannot belong to the Lord's assembly. Not even the 10th generation of such people can belong to the Lord's assembly. So the Hebrew Bible does not like Moabites. And so the fact that Ruth is a Moabite is really kind of loaded. It is charged. So when we come to the book of Ruth, we should have this backstory in mind. Okay. Now, interestingly, the book of Ruth itself starts out with a famine in Israel. Naomi and her husband Elimelech live with their sons Mahlon and Chilion in Bethlehem, which ironically means house of bread or house of food, Beit Lechem. But there's no food in Bethlehem, and so they flee to Moab, where they're going to make a life there. By the way, the names Mahlon and Chilion mean something like sickness and consumption. So, like, they named their children things that were very clearly dooming them to death, as we'll see. Probably, of course, these are literary names and not historical names, but it's kind of funny. I say in the book, it's like naming your kids like Deathy McDeathface and Sicky Sickerson. Like, you shouldn't do that. So, Naomi and Elimelech go to Moab. And while they're in Moab, Mahlon and Chilion take wives of Moabite women. So now we have intermarried Israelites. The older is Orpah, and the second one is Ruth. And so they live 10 years in Moab, and then tragedy strikes. Elimelech dies, and then Mahlon and Chilion die. None of them have children, and so only Naomi is left, without her 2 children, without her husband. But she does have her 2 Moabite daughters-in-law. Now Naomi tries to get them to go home. She says, "Go back to your mother's house, and may the Lord deal faithfully with you." Then she kisses them goodbye, like, see you later. And they say, both of them, "No, we're going to return with you to your people." Now, in the next verses, Naomi goes on to tell them, no, you really, like, for real, you should go back. I'm not going to have any more children. You're not going to have anyone to marry. Like, it's just going to be us, like widows, for the rest of our life. But Ruth decides she's going to stay. Orpah goes home, but Ruth decides to stay. And she does so with this kind of famous passage that you might have heard, if you're a Christian, you might have heard this actually in a Christian wedding service, even though it's spoken between a woman and her mother-in-law. This is such a beautiful statement of commitment that it gets used in Christian worship services fairly often. So Ruth says, "Don't urge me to abandon you, to turn back from following you. Wherever you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. Wherever you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord do this to me and more, if even death separates me from you." So Ruth has made this lifelong commitment. I'm going to give up my land, my people, and my gods, and I'm going to come with you. And I'm going to be with you until you die, and then until I die, and I'm going to be buried with you. It's a beautiful statement of her commitment to her Israelite mother-in-law. Now remember, if the book of Ruth, as I'm suggesting, is written in a time of anxiety about immigrants, this passage could be read as saying, no, look at this Moabite woman and her devotion to her Israelite mother-in-law. Like, Moabites aren't bad people. Look at Ruth. She is an example of the kind of commitment that people can make to each other. Now, Ruth then goes with Naomi back to Bethlehem, and when they get there, the whole town is all a flutter. And they say, "Can this be Naomi?" Now, Naomi, interestingly, the name Naomi means sweetness. So she says to them, "Don't call me Naomi, but call me Mara." Mara means bitter. And she says, "The Almighty has made me very bitter. I went away full, but the Lord has returned me empty." Now, a couple of things to notice about that. One is biblical characters get name changes from time to time in the Hebrew Bible. So Avram becomes Avraham, Jacob becomes Israel, and so on. But this is one of the few cases, the only one I can actually think of, where somebody changes their own name. So she changes her name from sweetness to bitterness. And then she says, "The Lord returned me empty." But if you picture the scene, Naomi is standing there with her daughter-in-law Ruth. And yet she's saying that she's empty. She has discounted Ruth. Ruth is to her as nothing. But you're going to see in the next chapter that Ruth is in fact quite something. In chapter 2 of the book, then, Ruth and Naomi have to find a way to make their way in the world. 2 women, 2 widows, no children, and they have to survive. So the narrator tells us that Naomi had a relative named Elimelech, through the family of Elimelech, whose name is Boaz. The narrator doesn't tell us in what way that is significant at this moment. It's just kind of dropped in there as kind of an anticipatory notice. If you've read the book, you know that Boaz is going to end up being married to Ruth and redeeming Naomi's land. And so he's a major character. But he's just kind of dropped in here a little bit casually by the narrator. Now, interestingly, it is Ruth the Moabite, and she is called Ruth the Moabite here, who says, "Let me go to the field so that I may glean among the ears of grain behind someone in whose eyes I might find favor." And Naomi says, "Sure, like, go ahead." Now, what is happening here is that Ruth the Moabite seems to know about this law in the book of Leviticus. We find a similar law in the book of Deuteronomy, but this one in Leviticus 19 is about what to do with your land. And so when you harvest your land's produce, you must not harvest all the way to the edge of your field. Don't gather up every remaining bit of your harvest. Do not pick your vineyard clean or gather all the grapes. Leave these for the poor and the immigrant. I am the Lord your God. So what Ruth is saying to Naomi is, there's this law in Leviticus that says people need to leave produce in their fields for the immigrant. And that is me. And so I'm going to go gather. So she has this plan that is embedded in Israelite law, and she's the one who comes up with this strategy for how they're going to survive. Now Ruth goes and she ends up in the field of Boaz. The text tells us by chance. So we could talk a long time about by chance and whether God's hand is in the chance, but we'll save that for another day. So while Ruth is working, Boaz comes home and he says to his overseer, who is not who is this young woman, but to whom does this young woman belong? It's kind of an interesting way to ask it. Like, who are this woman's people? He knows she's not an Israelite. She doesn't belong here, and so he wants to know who she is. So the young man who's overseeing says, she's a young Moabite, the one who returned with Naomi from the territory of Moab. So hear that? She's a Moabite from Moab. Like, she's being marked very clearly here as a foreigner. And that's crucial to our identity. If you go back and look at the text, actually, you will notice that in chapter 1, when they're in Moab, Ruth is just called Ruth. It's not until they show up in Bethlehem that Ruth is called Ruth the Moabite. And she's called that almost without exception for the rest of the book. So it's very clear that she's a Moabite. So she said, "Please let me glean so that I might gather up grain from among the bundles." She arrived and has been on her feet from the morning until now and has sat down only for a moment. So she's here, she's polite, she's working hard. She was faithful to Naomi. Now, Boaz then goes and talks to Ruth. And part of what he says to Ruth is, hey, don't go anywhere else. Stay here with my young women. Keep your eyes on the field that they are harvesting and go along after them. So he's given her a place, not exactly with his women, not with his household, but nearby, right? Go along and they'll kind of look out for you. Go to I'm not going to let you be harassed. When you're thirsty, go get water. Like, do the things that the workers do. Now, Ruth bows down and says, "How have I found favor in your eyes that you notice me? I'm an immigrant." Now, this is an interesting, like, Ruth is acknowledging, like, she is lowering herself, literally bowing down, saying, "I don't deserve this. I'm an immigrant. Why are you being gracious to me?" She is inventive. She knows the law. She is hardworking. She is polite. She's deferential. And so you can hear the book of Ruth kind of saying in this Ezra-Nehemiah context, if you read it that way, look, you've heard these stories about Moabites, but let us tell you what Moabites are really like. They have all these wonderful characteristics embodied in this character, Ruth. So Boaz says, "I know what you've done for Elimelech and for your mother-in-law Naomi. Those are my people. Well, he actually doesn't say that, but they are his people, and he's heard what they've done." And so he's rewarding her, like he's returning good faith for good faith, is what he's doing. And then he wishes a blessing for her at the hand of Yahweh. So Ruth stays and she gleans, and she threshes out an ephah. That is 20 quarts, 5 gallons of barley. That's a lot of barley for a day's labor, already threshed out and gleaned. She picked it up and she goes to town. Naomi then meets her and sees what she's got and says, "Where did you glean today? Where did you work? May that person be blessed." She doesn't know who the person is, but she wants that person to be blessed because the harvest has been so bountiful for them. So then Ruth says, "The name of the man with whom I work today is Boaz." Dun, 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 right? We know from chapter 2, verse 1, that Boaz is a relative of Naomi, but Ruth doesn't know that until right now. We have had access to this information that she has not had. Naomi says, oh, may he be blessed by the Lord who hasn't abandoned his faithfulness. The man is one of our close relatives. He's one of our redeemers. Now, this issue of redeemer is crucial to the book of Ruth, and what it means is not entirely clear. So there's two possibilities, at least two possibilities. One is that this is a reference to what is known as the law of levirate marriage, which you can find in the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 25. That law says that if brothers live together and one of them dies without a son, that is, dies without an heir, the dead man's wife must not go outside the family and marry a stranger, but her brother-in-law should go to her and take her as his wife. So if I die without a child, my brother will marry my wife, and they will consummate the marriage according to the brother-in-law's duty, and my brother will name his oldest child with my wife after me, and that child will carry on my legacy. This is a way of keeping people from being just cut off from the people of Israel if they die without a male heir. So the brother of the dead man is supposed to marry his wife and produce a child for the dead brother. This is one meaning of the word redeemer. There's also this other provision in Leviticus 25 when one of your fellow Israelites faces financial difficulty and must sell part of their property, the closest relative will come and buy back what their fellow Israelite has sold. So if you're poor and you need money, you got to sell your piece of land, then a relative is supposed to come and buy that land to keep it in the family, and then either you can purchase it back from your relative, or on the year of Jubilee in the 50th year, the relative will give it back to you. This is a way of keeping land from accruing to one powerful person or family. It keeps the land spread around the family, and it also keeps people from falling into poverty. This is another meaning of the word redeemer. It's not entirely clear in what way Naomi means that Boaz is a redeemer. It actually is going to turn out in chapter 4, as we'll see in just a minute, that he's going to end up being a redeemer in both of these ways. My own take on it is that Naomi is thinking of him as a land redeemer, because if he were being thought of in terms of levirate marriage, first of all, levirate marriage is only required of the brother-in-law, and that is not what Elimelech is. He's a more distant relative. And second, if Elimelech were legally required to marry Ruth, they could just go to court and say, hey, we need to get married. They don't have to do all the kind of plotting that they're going to do in the rest of the book. So I think Naomi is thinking, this guy can buy my land. But there's also going to be this strategy about how Ruth is going to marry Boaz that plays out in Ruth chapter 3. So they stay, Ruth does, with Boaz until the end of the harvest, gleaning from his field. Now, at the end of the harvest, Naomi decides that she needs to find a husband for Ruth. And so she's got this strategy that we'll look at next week about how Ruth can marry Boaz. I don't want to get into it right now because it's such an interesting text, and we need more time to talk about it. So let me just say the quick and short of it is, by the end of chapter 3, Ruth has suggested to Boaz that he should marry her, and he has agreed. The problem is that Boaz there's a nearer relative who is a closer redeemer who has the right to the property that Naomi has. And so Elimelech's land is at stake, as is this marriage between Boaz and Ruth. So in chapter 4, verse 1, Boaz goes to the city gate. This is where kind of legal things happened. He calls over this fellow who's called in the Hebrew Poloni Almoni, which basically means what's his face. You know he's not going to be important in the text. But he calls them together. He gets 10 witnesses, and he says, look, here's the deal. Naomi has come back from Moab. She has a portion of a field that belonged to our relative Elimelech. I thought I should let you know and say buy it in the presence of those sitting here and in the presence of my people. If you will redeem it, redeem it. But if you won't redeem it, tell me so that I may know. There isn't anyone to redeem it except you, and I'm in line after you. So-and-so, what's-his-face, says, I will redeem it. Okay, so this is a great deal for what's-his-face, right? Because Here's this woman who has no descendants who is selling a piece of land. There's not going to be anyone to come around at the Jubilee year to ask for the land back. And so he's got this new piece of land and he can keep it for himself. So then Boaz says, on the day you buy the field from Naomi, there's a textual issue here, but I'm going to translate it. I will acquire Ruth the Moabite, the wife of the dead man. So you buy the land, I'm going to marry the wife of the dead man, and then I'm going to preserve the dead man's name for his inheritance. Now this is a really interesting move that Boaz has made. He has said, look, you can buy the land, but when you do, I'm going to marry Naomi. I'm going to marry Ruth. And then he makes a move that has not been made yet in the text, which is, and I'm going to have my first child with Ruth be the heir of Mahlon and Elimelech. So now he's messed up the deal, right? Because now there is going to be a descendant who can come back and claim the land from What's-His-Face later. So now the Redeemer, What's-His-Face, says, nope, can't do it. I'm going to damage my own inheritance. You can have the land. So what Boaz has done, along with Ruth and Naomi, is he's figured out a plan where he can redeem Naomi's land, keep them together, marry Ruth, and have a child to carry on Mahlon and Elimelech's line. It's a really nice kind of maneuvering that these three have done. What they've really done is created a new family with Ruth has made this commitment to stay with Naomi. Boaz now has married Ruth. They're going to have a child together. And so all of these different commitments are kind of brought together in this really interesting way. Now, all the people at the gate say, we are witnesses, and then they bless Ruth in this really kind of fascinating way. May she be like Rachel and Leah, the two matriarchs of Israel. So Ruth, this Moabite woman, is being elevated all the way up to the status of Rachel and Leah. Like, this is a really profound kind of blessing that the people have given to this Moabite woman. May you be fertile, and may you preserve a name in Bethlehem, and may your household be like the household of Perez. This is a distant relative of Elimelech, whom all the people in the town presumably are related to, whom Tamar bore to Judah. This is a reference to Genesis 38, and go read Genesis 38. It's a fascinating text. But long story short, Tamar seems to be a Canaanite, and she also has some issues with the law of levirate marriage, that she has to kind of use her wits in order to carry on the family line. So here you have Tamar, a foreign woman who carries on the family line of Perez. Now you have Ruth, a foreign woman who carries on the line of Elimelech. So Boaz took Ruth and she became his wife. He was intimate with her. The Lord let her become pregnant. She gave birth to a son. So now Naomi has been restored. Elimelech's family line has been restored. This story that was about loss and death now becomes about birth and new life. So the townspeople bless her. Your daughter-in-law is better than 7 sons, whereas at the end of chapter 1, Naomi had said she was empty-handed. Now people are recognizing the value of Ruth as being better than seven sons. Then we get this statement. Naomi took the child and held him to his breast. She became his guardian. The neighborhood women gave him a name, saying, a son has been born to Naomi. They called his name Obed. He became Jesse's father and David's grandfather. Now that name David just falls in there, right? We haven't been thinking about David at all. And suddenly we realize that the family line of this guy Elimelech is the family line of King David. This whole story has been pointing the way to the first king of Israel, the one who united Israel in the monarchy. In case you didn't get it, it's going to go all the way back to Perez, and it's going to repeat the genealogy. Perez, the father of Hezron, Hezron, Ram, and Amminadab, Nahshon, Salmon, Boaz, the father of Obed, the father of Jesse, the father of David. And the book ends in English and in Hebrew on that word, David. Now, there's a lot one can draw out of this story, but if you go back and place it in our timeline of ancient Israel, then what we have is a text that is written in the time of Ezra and Nehemiah in the period of the returned exiles who are anxious about the presence of immigrants and sending away their Moabite, Ammonite, Egyptian wives. And then you have this story written about the distant past in which a Moabite woman is the great-grandmother of King David. So now what the book is doing is it is saying, hey, all of you Israelites in the time of Ezra and Nehemiah who are afraid of immigrants, let me tell you something. If this immigrant Moabite woman had not married an Israelite man, there never would have been a King David. That is, you want to make Israel great now by getting rid of immigrants. Well, Israel never would have been great at all if it were not for this Moabite woman. King David, our greatest king, was the descendant of a Moabite great-grandmother. Now that is profound and reorienting, and it is engaging kind of head on with this fear of immigrants, this anti-immigrant anxiety, this urge toward ethnic purity in the time of Ezra and Nehemiah. It is saying immigrants are valuable, immigrants have contributed to our society, immigrants are fundamental, foundational to our society. All the way back to Ruth, there would have been no David. All the way back to Tamar, there would have been no Elimelech. David is the product of this line that was only carried forward because of immigrant women. So shame on you, Ezra and Nehemiah, I think is what the book of Ruth is saying, for being afraid of immigrants. Immigrants are vital to society. Now you can hear that in the time of Ezra and Nehemiah. You can hear that obviously clearly in our own day. And so the book of Ruth then enters into our own conversations about the way we treat immigrants and foreigners and minorities and our impulses in our own time that are anxious and sometimes pretty viciously biased against foreigners and immigrants and minorities. Now, that reading of the book of Ruth is a pretty positive one. It is a challenging one to anti-immigrant sentiment. But we're going to come back next time and look at the ways in which that reading of Ruth is itself problematic. So I want to leave you just with that, and we'll come back in the next video and we'll talk a little bit more about the ways I think the book of Ruth is trying to do something really good by way of valuing immigrants, but by way of doing so, it creates some problems of its own, and we'll look at those next time. If you're looking for me, you can find me at robertwilliamsonjr.com, on Facebook at robertwilliamsonjr.author, Twitter at rwilliamsonjr. Please go and listen to the Bible Worm podcast. We have episodes on Ruth that are being recorded kind of alongside these video lectures. If you want to get in touch with me, I'm Robert at robertwilliamsonjr.com. Thanks for being here. I'll look forward to seeing you next time.